that looks almost like we're there. Okay, I'm
Okay.
gonna shut the screen
Yeah.
and see if we can get things to pop up. Here we go. Okay.
Okay.
Oh my. Welcome everybody, and great to talk to everyone again. This is a subject close to our hearts, as John said. When we first moved to Newfoundland, we explored the Barrens and we were absolutely intrigued by them, but couldn't find very much about them. So that led to us going back again and again and again to try to figure out what was actually happening there. And this talk, I guess, is one of the results of that. See if I can advance. What's going on? Why is this not advanced? Oh, yeah, that's it. Everyone here knows where Newfoundland is, I'm sure, but occasionally we give talks to people who aren't entirely sure. But the important thing about the map is, of course, just how far north Newfoundland is, and that has a really important effect on the actual formation of the Barrens. Newfoundland and Labrador are very large together. The province is over 400 square kilometers. So it's a very, very large land area. The island itself is pretty big, over 100,000, over 100,000 square kilometers. But the limestone barrens are only a very tiny portion of that. If you look up closely at the west coast of the island, which is the only place that there really are limestone barrens along the west coast and up into southern Labrador. The tiny red dots on this map represent those barrens. And if you can't see the dots, the arrows help point out the largest of them anyway. These barrens are extremely small because of the climatic conditions in this part of the island. So the Barrens, if you add the area of the actual open Barrens up, you get about 0.4% of the island of Newfoundland, 0.04% of the island of Newfoundland, and 0.01% of the entire province. They're very, very tiny in area, and that's because they're so restricted, yet they have so many rare plants, that is why they're very, very important for us to protect. If you scraped all those barrens, those little red bits together and plunked them down on top of St. John's, this is about how much space they take up. They wouldn't even cover the entire city. So once again, you can see this is a very tiny area of appropriate habitat for a large, large number of rare plants, some of which don't grow anywhere else in the world. The barrens are created by climate. That northern position that we were talking about interacts with the bedrock to stop trees and other plants from growing. Most of the bedrock, well, about 1/3 of the bedrock on the Northern Peninsula is either limestone or dolomite, high calcium material. And that's shown in orange and in yellow on this map. So you can see it covers a very large area going right down to the Port of Port. Yet those little red dots are the only parts that are still barren. Those are the only parts that are appropriate for a lot of the plants. What's happened over time is wetlands and forests started growing after the retreat of the ice over those limestone barrens, over those areas of limestone in the interior of the province, and completely covered them up. So this is what we have today. Forest, lakes, bogs, wetlands that completely smother all the rest of the limestone, and just these tiny red dots along the coast. The frost-shattered rock of the limestone barrens is one of the results of those climatic changes that go on because of the exposure and the lack of vegetation. And if you've ever been on the barrens in the winter, you realize that the snow, for the most part, doesn't stay on them. The winds are so strong off the ocean that the snow gets blown away. There might be a thin crust of ice over the ground, but you get a lot of exposed rock and a lot of exposed gravel. And consequently, especially at the beginning and the ends of the winter, you get a lot of freezing and thawing. Water is constantly in that soil because it's close to the ocean, and the freezing and thawing shapes what happens with the soil. We all know just how cold the ocean can be, even in summer, where you have icebergs drifting down from Labrador across the top of the island. But you also get very cold waters all the way down the west coast through the summer for the most part. And that also makes it difficult for a lot of plants to survive in those open, windy sites. The bedrock, as we've said, is limestone. It's pretty well all late Cambrian, early Ordovician limestone. And all the way up, you get a whole series of different and interesting geological features that it's really fun just to explore, even for the geology. Even if you're not looking at the plants, there's a lot to see up there. Lots of fossils, including meter-long orthocones, these ancient squid relatives, giant snails the size of apples, layered and unlayered bacterial mounds. These would be photosynthetic bacteria that acted almost like corals do today, forming these mound-like structures in the shallow, warm sea that used to cover these rocks when they were much further south. You also get interesting other interesting rocks mixed in with them, like beds of sorry, I'm brain dead here, chert that are interbedded with the limestone. And the chert is a very hard silicious rock. It's almost like glass. And that was the most important tool material for early peoples here. So they also were using these coastal limestone outcrops and barrens for both for hunting and for finding materials for tools. At Port-au-Choix, there are very important archaeological discoveries and other headlands all up and down the coast. These exposed headlands were important hunting sites because they stuck out into the ocean. That's part of the reason that they have such little vegetation, but that also made them really important for early hunters, especially during the sealing season. Glaciation stripped off pretty well all of the overburden. Very little was left anywhere in the province. And the limestone, the soft rock of the limestone was shaped very severely by the moving ice. So in places where you have exposed limestone, if it didn't shatter since the last ice age, you had these large, smooth barrens like on St. John Island, this limestone pavement that just goes off in all directions. There are so few cracks in this rock that almost nothing can grow there. There's no place for soil to accumulate and no place for water to go down and crack it up into smaller boulders or into gravel. This is unusual, but you do get it in the limestone here on the west coast of the island. More common is this kind of structure, the Clinton-Greig landscape, where the limestone, as the rock, the limey marine sediments turned into rock, water was removed, the limestone shrank and formed a series of parallel cracks. And those cracks, now that they're exposed to weathering, have been eroded by acid in soils and acid in groundwater to become deeper and wider. And you end up with these peculiar, it looks almost like constructed walls or blocks that are being carved out, but that's a completely natural feature of the limestone. And this is very common throughout the limestone barrens. The next step is rocks that have broken up completely into either head-size or fist-sized chunks like this at Watts Point. This is slightly dolomitized, so it's a bit yellowish. It has almost no plants growing in it because it's just too porous. Any seeds go down far too far or get into water where they are waterlogged, but they can't actually get sunlight because this is a very wet area too. And you can see there's one glacial erratic, a piece of a granite boulder sitting in the middle there, and that's completely covered with lichens, whereas there are essentially no lichens growing on the rest of the rock because the limestone just weathers too quickly for slow-growing lichens. And then the last sort of stage you get is this very fine gravel at places like Burnt Cape and Port-au-Choix, where the entire surface of the rock has shattered and been broken apart, and the gravel is accumulated, sometimes just as a very thin veneer. In other places, it can be a meter or so deep. And this is where some of the most interesting plants are often found. This is a very unusual habitat. Unfortunately, this is also exactly, it looks like driveway gravel and was used like driveway gravel when people discovered it during the building of the highway up the west coast. So the natural gravel was used very extensively to the detriment of the rare plants. The gravel tends to be very sharp-edged because rainwater, slightly acidic rainwater, which is normal around here, as it falls on the rock, the acids in the water eat away at the surface of the gravel. And so instead of having flat or smooth surfaces, the edges get dissolved, etched, yes, into sharp points and slicing edges. So if you've ever kneeled on this or fallen on this, you know just how unpleasant it can be. But this is the natural habitat for a lot of our rare plants, this peculiar, sharp, unlikely looking substrate. I talked a bit earlier about frequent freezing and thawing. And because although the rock looks like it's driveway gravel or desert-like, it isn't. It's always moist. But just because this is Newfoundland, there's always moisture somewhere nearby, somewhere down just below the rock. And as that water freezes, especially in the fall and spring, where you get freezing and refreezing, you often get these ice candles developing in the soil. And the crystals will grow from day to day. They tend to push they push all of the soil up and outwards from the point at which the crystals are forming. And over a large area, you often have a whole series of different points where the soil is undergoing this freezing process. And they tend to push the larger rocks. After many, many years of freezing and thawing, you end up with the larger rocks being arranged in circles around the finer material. And you get either little frost boils like this, which are big enough you could probably cover them with your hand, to larger size ones. These are about a foot size across, about a foot, about 25 centimeters, to really large ones that are several meters across, such as these at Burnt Cape. And this mobile soil, this cryogenically churned soil, is really important for plants because where the larger rocks have accumulated, once again, it's too coarse for most plants to actually take root. So that those areas tend to be pretty sterile. Those are the light gray parts of the photograph. The middle of these rings, if they're active, tend to be too mobile. The soil is constantly churning. So plants, if they try to root, they just get churned out at the next freeze-thaw cycle. The only place that plants can really safely grow is right around the edges. So you see these rings of vegetation in these peculiar patterned ground fields. Here's another one from a slightly different angle, also at Burnt Cape. And I've outlined some of the rings so you can see just how many there are. The light has to be absolutely perfect, otherwise they're very hard to see. On a slight slope, those rings tend to turn into stone stripes. So you get these peculiar stripy effects. You find the same thing in other soils. It doesn't just have to be limestone. In the tablelands, for example, we have the same kinds of soils. Anywhere that there's no vegetation and you have a lot of frost churning, you can have these features start up. So wherever plants can find a bit of shelter, like around the edges of the rings or in the shelter of large rocks or in the shelter of other plants, if seeds can come to rest and find a bit of soil, they'll try to grow. And over time, you get little islands, little patches of vegetation. In most cases, they start with one plant and a couple of other seedlings start to grow around them. And after a while, you end up with a dozen or even more different species all growing in the same patch. If you look at them from the Barrens from the air, you can see that the overall look of the Barrens is pretty patchy too. The little vegetation islands are too small to show in this. This is the tip of Port-au-Choix National Historic Site. The road is on the right, the power line to the left, the road power line is on the left, so you get an idea of scale. You can see all these peculiar lines of vegetation. Those are all sea level, old beaches as sea level fell, and the tip of the cape became exposed after the last ice age. And if you look at where the white patches are on this, those are all complete gravel barrens. That's where there's almost no vegetation other than those tiny little islands. This is a close-up of one of those white patches, and you can see a trail in the upper left-hand side. That's what the red is marking. That's a walking trail. So you get an idea of size. But this shows the very patchy nature of those gravel barrens. In the open, you get the vegetation islands. Over time, those can merge to form the thicker patches that we see to the sides and to the bottom of the photograph. And over a much longer time, if things stabilize, you can end up with as much cover as you see at Watts Point, where in some places you have just solid green patches of turf with that are just full of all the different kinds of limestone living plants. That isn't necessarily stable, however, because all it takes is some damage to the heath, either a winter that doesn't have enough snow cover and you get plants drying out and dying, and then the wind getting in under them and blowing out the soil, or ATV tracks on a barren, or any kind of damage like that to that thin skin of living plants can cause blowouts like this. And they again, are very common on the barrens, both natural blowouts and human-caused blowouts. And given a bit more time, that can turn into almost bring the barren right back to the gravel state that it was in originally. This is a boat harbor, and in places there, 80–90% of the vegetation is gone. And pioneer species like mountain avens and moss campion and so on are starting to come back up in that bare gravel. It's gone from solid heath cover back to almost bare gravel it was in the first place. The harsh climate on the Barrens, because of the strong winds and the cool summer and winter conditions and the lack of insulating snow cover, means that plants are forced to grow in certain ways, either because they naturally grow that way and they can take advantage of the conditions, like the Arctic plants, the cushion plants, or they're pruned that way by the harshness of the weather. They every time they try to grow, they get killed back, pruned smaller and pruned smaller. So they end up just creeping across the ground. Cushion plants, Arctic cushion plants, here's a typical one, purple saxifrage. They pretty well always stay within a couple of centimeters of the ground, within what's called the boundary layer. And if you had a wind blowing from left to right over this, here's a graph that'll show you what happened. As the wind blows across the ground, the lower part of the graph, the wind speed, the velocity is slowed by friction with the ground surface. So, as you get slightly higher from that, the wind speed isn't slowed as much until you get over the boundary layer and you've got the full wind velocity at that height. And usually that's 4 or 5 centimeters above the ground. It's not very far up, but that drag on the ground is what creates the boundary layer, the slowed wind speed and a chance for the plants both to avoid being desiccated by wind or being what am I looking for? Brain's gone here. It reduces desiccation and allows the plants to live. Oh, the heat. You end up with more heat radiating from the soil and staying there rather than being blown away. So that's also very important for these plants. So the the purple saxifrage, the encrusted saxifrage, a lot of plants, muscampion, all have that sort of cushion shape. They are very, very typical on the Barrens. Here's an extreme mound of muscampion, getting to the point where it's sticking out of the boundary layer and will eventually probably get killed off because it's just too tall. Other plants, as I say, can either stay small naturally, like the silky willow. Well, some of the various willows, this actually probably isn't silky willow. I'm not sure why it's called that. I had to take a closer look at that. But some of the little willows are short naturally. They never get tall. Other plants like the junipers get pruned down so they really just creep along the ground. They can get up over a meter tall in good conditions, but on the Barrens they never will. Here's some extremely dwarfed plants from the Barrens, muscampion on the left and a little Laurentian primrose on the right. And of course, the Brayas in protected conditions, even the Brayas can get, 10 centimeters tall. But on the Barrens, in places in Port au Choix, you're lucky if you ever see them over 2 centimeters. They're very tiny. And that makes them a little bit challenging both to find and to photograph, which is one of the big frustrations with working with some of these plants. They are so difficult to locate. There's been a lot of work done on the Barrens over the years, but it's sort of been leading up to where we are, and it's been leading up to where we are now. Some of the earliest work was done by M.L. Fernald back in the early part of the 1900s. He came up for, over the course of almost 20 years, on a series of different trips with colleagues to look at the plants, because Newfoundland at that point was relatively unexplored, and it was a great chance from Harvard University in the US. It was a great chance to find some unusual plants and see places that other people had not really spent any time. There are a lot of other people explored both for plants and for animals over the years. And by the 1960s, but still we didn't really understand just how uncommon, how rare some of these plants and the habitat was. In the 60s and 70s, the highway was constructed up the West Coast. Before that, there was a coastal trail. That was about all, a walking trail. But when the highway was constructed, it unfortunately ran right along the coast and ran through a lot of these barrens. And as I said earlier, these natural gravels were extremely attractive to the people constructing the highway because they were just sitting there waiting to be used. And in many places, the overlying vegetation was scraped to the side. The gravel was used to make the roadbed, and the highway went right over the top of the Barrens. And because of that, we lost a lot of the area of natural barrens that existed originally. By the 1980s, 1990s, people were starting to realize just how important some of these barrens were. It was becoming clear that there were plants there that were uncommon nationally. There were plants that looked like they may only exist there, the endemic species that we know now. And it was realized that the barrens weren't as extensive as perhaps people thought, that they didn't extend inland. They all were along the coast. And what you saw was all that we had. So it started to become really important to find out more about what was there and just how common and uncommon it was. Various botanists continued to come, particularly Ernest Rouleau, who was hired by the province in 1948. And worked for about 20 years on the Barrens. And his student, André Bouchard, along with Stu Hay, Luc Brouillet, and several other botanists from Quebec, came back year after year and really helped flesh out just what we had and just how common some of those plants were. And that culminated in the Museum of Nature Coelogeous Rare Vascular Plants of the Island of Newfoundland publication. And that really sort of laid out for the first time what was which were the rarest plants and which were the rarest habitats in our province, on the island part of the province anyway. Sue Meads did an assessment of Brea that was published in 2000, or completed in 2000. And it was at that point that the assessment of Brea longii as both extremely rare and endemic started to become widely known. And there was also work in that period by the Newfoundland Rare Plant Team and other botanists around the province trying to flesh out this understanding of just how rare and important the limestone barrens were. In 1997, the provincial government established a recovery team, originally for Brea, and then broadened to include a whole series of limestone barren species. And that team continues to work right up to this day to try to both understand and to protect these important limestone habitats. The interesting thing about limestone is that it's water soluble, it's very easily eroded. You end up with a whole lot of fascinating landforms along with the plants that grow there. So as you're traveling from south to north along the coast, you'll come across all sorts of strange natural sculptures and caves and grottos and arches and statue-like things. It's a really fascinating place, even just visually, to explore. Burnt Cave has a couple of beautiful large caves that you can go down the beach and look into. It also has, this is another common limestone feature, these solution holes you get where algae in the summer, the algae will die off and start to release acids, and the acids will eat into very, very slowly eat into the intertidal zone rocks and create a series of these peculiar smooth potholes, cannon holes, two small caves also at Burnt Cape. Visually it's fascinating, and certainly geologically it's fascinating, but the important thing, I guess, for our group is to talk a bit about the plants. And these headlands, as we said, that are exposed to some of the worst weather that we have in the province throughout the year, are the places that these Arctic plants, originally plants that would have been at the edge of the melting ice, presumably, at the end of the Ice Age, they probably once covered a much larger portion of our island, but now are reduced to living in these exposed areas where other plants cannot outcompete them. Elsewhere, as I said, the forests and the bogs have covered up the limestone, but here the plants are able to survive because everything is against the growth of shrubs and trees, of other softer herbaceous plants. These are the toughest plants that we have, and they are able to live in this really harsh environment, but they only live there as long as there's no other competition to shade them out or to take the nutrients from them. There are small patches of limestone barrens in the southern part of southeastern part of Labrador. They tend to be pretty restricted, but again, there are some limestone living plants in there that are of great importance. The barren rock that we talked about earlier is one of the habitat types. In this case, you have exposed rock knobs, and the plants are really growing in the shelter in between these rock knobs, in the crevices and in the wet areas. Any low-lying places where there's a bit of water collecting and a little bit of soil collecting, that's where you end up with the plants. The top is too dry and too weather beaten. That sort of Clinton Greik terrain underlies forest in a lot of the other parts of the island. If you go up to the underground salmon hole, for example, and look along the trail, even though you're far inland, you'll see exactly the same cracked limestone bedrock with the deep holes, but it's buried for the most part under the forest soil. Here again at Cape Norman, it looks almost like someone has constructed a wall there, but that's the natural cracking of the limestone as it's drying that creates that feature. And Flowers Cove, the same sort of terrain with holes that go down almost 2 meters with trees growing out of them and little fern patches and all sorts of other plants growing at the bottoms. This is a fascinating trail for people to explore to get an idea of what limestone plants can actually put up with. There are lots of raised sea cliffs along the coast, limestone sea cliffs. This one is at Cowhead, but they're all the way down the coast. You come across them with ferns and other plants growing on them. Also, limestone cliffs, so right the way down to Cornerbrook and further south that have important plants growing on them. This one is in Bombay, east arm of Bombay. And there are even sites where disturbances have taken place over time. Portachoir National Historic Site, for example, the road out to the lighthouse went over the Barrens, as did the main roads we were talking about earlier. And a lot of damage was done. Quarrying was done to either side. But over time, some of those quarried areas, such as this one, has started to grow back with plants, in this case, juniper and oxytropis, that are doing quite well, and Dryas, mountain avens. They're doing quite well as pioneer species on this exposed limestone. And to the south, we have the very important southern limestone barrens on the Port-au-Port Peninsula. And up on Table Mountains is also a fascinating area. And this is where we now have concerns about the windmill generating site that has just been approved, I guess, today to go ahead. We'll see what develops there over time, I guess. These are a couple of other peculiarities of the limestone barrens. The underground salmon hole is a couple of caves along the course of Beaver Brook near on the way to Roddington, and the salmon have to come up river and then go through a cave, pop out the other side, come out into a river again, then into another cave under a ridge, and then pop back out into the river on the other side of that. So they're sort of semi-subterranean salmon, which is a bit peculiar. You can see them. There are probably about 100 in this pool, I think, when the photograph was taken. So a few of them show up in the photograph. And there are various caves up and down. Most of them are fairly small and fairly recent. This is Cornerbrook Cave. But again, we're more interested in the plants, but the caves are a pretty fascinating feature too. And the big sinkhole at Lomond, where a large cave's roof collapsed and left about a 60 foot, 20 meter deep pit with a waterfall cascading into it. And the Humber River Gorge, again, these talus slopes and cliffs of, in this case, marble, which is a metamorphosed, harder form of limestone, but still high in calcium and a difficult place for many plants to live, and with some very interesting limestone-loving plants associated with that bedrock type. Another peculiar one is Romaines River. In this case, it's not limestone, but it's a related rock formed as an ancient sea dried up. So you end up with a salt layer, the salt, not table salt, but calcium sulfate or gypsum, which forms these painfully white cliffs that support small numbers of plants such as dryas, the mountain avens, and a few other limestone-loving plants. And another peculiar place is south of Gros Morne, Chimney Cove. It's basalt, so it's a volcanic rock, but it has a very high calcium content. So again, you have some calcium-loving plants that are found there that wouldn't be on the other nearby rocks. They're there just because of the basalt. So let's take a look at some of the plants that grow on plants and animals that grow on the Barrens. At times of the year, such as early spring, the Barrens can be completely covered with flowers. In the northern part of the province, these are called maple. No, these aren't the mayflowers. These are Selenicolis. This is brain dead. Moss campion. As I was talking, I was thinking of purple saxifrage, and in the northern part of the province, people call purple saxifrage mayflower, but because of the time of year it comes out, and because it forms just carpets over some of the barrens. You can see a particular in places like around Table Head. Some of the barrens there are beautiful. It's just completely purple with the saxifrage. On the barrens, trees don't grow terribly well, as we said. If they grow tall, and in most places they don't, but if they grow tall, they're stunted. These are two probably fairly mature trees, and the top you can see eastern larch, and then below that you can see balsam fir branches. But those things could be decades old, but they're no taller than your knee. Even though they don't get tall, if there's any soil that's developed there and the seeds can get started, you'll end up with what amounts to a tiny forest growing around them. And if you look at the mushrooms in the foreground, that's a swillus. That's a swillus that's usually associated with larch. It grows on the roots of larch, and they have a symbiotic relationship. So here you have what would normally occur with a mature tree happening on a barren where the patch of soil is only a few meters across. It's very peculiar. There's an entire ring of these larch swillus growing here. Various other mushrooms, various other fungi seem to prefer calcium-rich soils. Some of the morels, this little helvella, this little morel relative that doesn't look at all like one, actually. Winella, for some reason or other, this peculiar rabbit's ear, some people call it, grows in quite large quantities and in a couple of different limestone sites. This is a sample, a box showing some of the material that was collected during one of our mushroom forays up on the Barrens, just a whole range of small and larger fungi collected during probably an hour on the Barrens. There are all sorts of things there, and we're still trying to figure out what actually is growing there. Here's one dear to Henry Mann's heart, Chara nitella, some of the peculiar macroalgae that grow in the calcium-rich ponds on the Barrens. You also get big greasy lumps of nostoc, a blue-green alga that is common in the more puddle-like areas. Lichens grow only really on the erratics in the Barrens, the non-limestone rocks for the most part. This one's growing because robins that are feeding in the area use this as a perch to look around for predators and for insects and so on. And every time they defecate, they leave a little pile of nitrogen-rich waste on the rock. And this Rosavskia really likes high nitrogen substrates, and so it does beautifully on these rocks. You can see them scattered across the landscape. These robin perches. On the firmer parts of the limestone, you sometimes see these fire dot lichens, and in wet places, these peculiar little volcanic crater-like chocolate chip lichens. Very strange things. This one's again not growing on limestone, it's growing on what looks like a bit of granite or something. Getting up to some of the green plants, there's a range of different ferns on the Barrens. This one is definitely associated with the limestone almost every time you find it, either in cracks and crevices or on cliff sides. Bulblet fern is fascinating. It produces spores, but it also produces little tiny bulbs or bulblets on the undersides of its fronds. And when those fall off, they'll root in the ground wherever they happen to land, just like a regular bulb would, and produce another little fern. Green spleenwort is almost always in very sheltered cracks and crevices, places that don't have strong sunlight that would dry them out. And Steller's rock break is there's a lot of that up at Portachois and also down at Lomond on the limestone cliffs there. As we started the program today, John Monder was talking about moonworts and some recent work that's been done on moonworts. And we're finding out that we have more species than we thought we had, but the one on the left-hand side that I have labeled as Bertricium lunaria, apparently now we know is not Bertricium lunaria. So we'll have to update that and probably most of our other names as time goes on. There are three really important plants that everyone should know about for the limestone barrens. These are the endemics, the plants that do not occur anywhere else. They're only on the limestone barrens, only on the west coast of the island, and in some cases they don't even live on, well, none of them live on all the limestone barrens. They're restricted even within those limestone barrens. Barrens willow is only in the very northern tip of the Northern Peninsula. It's a tiny willow. If you had a cup of tea with a saucer under it, and you look at that saucer, that's about the size of the entire tree, not the trunk diameter, that's the entire plant. This is a tree that never becomes a tree. It's just a little flat pad of shiny green leaves. The female was the first one, this is the male. They don't get big, they don't get widespread. They're a tiny little patch of a plant, and they're really only found from about Table Head up to the tip of the Northern Peninsula at Cook's Harbor. That's their entire range for the world. That's it. Very peculiar little tree. Oh, and here we have, oh, that was the male. That's true. We had a male and female earlier. Fernald's brea is a bit more widespread. This one is found from about the Barrens area up to the very tip of the Northern Peninsula. So again, up to Cook's Harbor, it grows throughout that area, but there aren't a lot of them, and they're very tiny. They're in the mustard family, and they have these white to purplish flowers. The tallest one would be maybe 10, 12 centimeters. And as I said, they can be much, much smaller than that, but they are extremely rare, only on the west coast of Newfoundland. Here's one of the smaller ones, along with an extinct penny. And Long's brea. This one, again, can be 12, maybe even 15 centimeters tall, but it's only really found in a few kilometers on either side of Flowers Cove. The range of this plant is extremely restricted, and because of that and the rarity of the habitat in which it lives, it and the other brea are considered endangered. This is a plant that is slightly more widespread. This little Griscom's arnica, very beautiful sunflower-like flower, much showier, yeah. And it grows 30, maybe 30 centimeters tall, not much more than that. But they're, again, very restricted. They're found in Western Newfoundland, and they're found in part of Quebec. The Quebec population, here's a map. All those sites in Quebec, I think they have less than 100 actual plants, flowering plants. We have, in the order of thousands here on the island. See if I can get back to that. There we go. Most of them up in those 3 dots up around Port-au-Choix. There are a few in the Gros Morne area too. But that's it. That's the entire world range for these plants. And the important 3 dots with the biggest population are those ones right up around Port-au-Choix.
And there are some related.
Oh, there are some other arnicas, which we'll talk about in a moment. Yeah, yeah. But this is the rarest one of them. Beautiful little plant. Okay. These are sort of the interesting numbers. 115 of our 270 odd rare plants, 115 of those species grow on the limestone barrens. They're not restricted to the limestone barrens. They grow well on the barrens. So if we protect the barrens, we're protecting those species. 29 of those species grow nowhere else on the island. They are absolutely restricted to the limestone barrens. We'll talk about a few of them, and we'll also talk about a few other things that are just interesting to look at. One of those is this Trentipolia, which is a weird alga that you'll find in some of the shadier parts of the barrens, just a peculiar green alga that produces a lot of carotenes to protect it. Crinkled snow lichen, he's got mixed together. This is found in a couple of places, but up on the Table Mountain, I think, is the most important site for it. Quite an uncommon lichen. Again, with the Laurentian primrose can be very tall in shady locations. It can be almost 20 centimeters tall, but on the barrens, it can be a centimeter. No elongation of the flower stem at all, just a couple of leaves and these little flowers popping up. In wetter sites, you get Mistassini primrose, big flowers, tiny leaves. It's hard to understand how a plant that small can produce a flower that large. They come in pink and white, so you'll often find them mixed together. There's a Greenland primrose, which is a sort of a beefier looking plant, mostly from Port-au-Choix northwards. You start to find this species. And there's a 4th one that I still haven't been able to find that we'll not worry about. Arctic bladderpod is a very colorful mustard relative on the barrens. The beautiful bright yellow flowers, and then these peculiar pea-like seed capsules at the end of long stems later in the year. We talked about Griscom's arnica. We have also a couple of other kinds of arnica here. Woolly arnica, which is very has a very fuzzy stem. Tomentos, yeah, like a sweater all over its green parts, probably protect it from wind desiccation. And narrow leaf arnica, which looks very much like a sweaterless form of the woolly arnica. Harebells, harebells grow quite widely throughout the province, but on the barrens there's a form that has fewer flowers and they're closer to the ground. It seems to be a fairly stable form, even though it's the same species as the taller one that you see elsewhere. Because if you transplant it, it doesn't get taller. It always stays short and close to the ground. Bog rosemary grows in many different places, but is particularly colorful on the Barrens. And partridge berry, everybody knows this as an edible berry on the island. Red-tipped lacewort is a really fascinating plant. It's a partially parasitic plant, feeding on taking sap from the roots of plants that it's growing around. And it has these incredibly bright yellow and red flowers. It's not very tall. It's only about 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters tall. But if you can find it, and you'd have to go up towards Watts Point to come across it, it really is a beautiful plant to see. We have about 4 or 5 locations for calypso on the island, one down on the Port-au-Port and the rest of them in the northern part of the Northern Peninsula. There are very few of them every year, and probably fewer and fewer now, but they don't seem to be doing terribly well from what I hear. But they are again, spectacular little orchid to come across. Whereas the yellow lady slippers do spectacularly well on the Barrens. There are thousands and thousands of them. This is one of the most characteristic plants on the Barrens in the early summer. They are absolutely amazing. And we have both the Barrens form and then the Macassin, the twisted, darker form in rich fens. Elegant pussy toes is pretty, as far as I know, only found on the Barrens. I don't think we've come across it anywhere else. It's a sort of a tall, very beautiful pussy toes, up to 20 centimeters tall, and it has slightly fragrant flowers, which is a bit interesting too, so honey scented. Showy cinquefoil is one of several different cinquefoils that grow on the Barrens. This species has very fuzzy, silvery, hairy undersides on the leaves, so it's easy to recognize. The alpine chickweed, related to the garden chickweed, but much, much tougher, has large, again, very hairy leaves. And the hairs in this case probably do several things on these plants. They help to reduce the amount of water loss when the sun's burning down on them, and also probably keep warm air around the leaves. They help to keep the plant warm enough that all of its chemical functions can continue. It's a very tiny draba, a plant in the mustard family. The whole plant is about 3 centimeters tall. You can see the little rosettes of leaves at the bottom, then a tall flowering stem with the seed capsules, these flattened seed capsules. Not a common plant at all in this province. River beauty grows in wet sites throughout the Barrens, but again, doesn't require limestone. Dwarf hawksbeard does. It's known really only from Burnt Cape, and I guess the couple were seen in the Cook's Harbor area at one point, and that may have been because gravel was moved from Burnt Cape in that over to there. Mountain avens is a pioneer species and is typical of pretty well all the Barrens. Anywhere that you find limestone, you're going to find mountain avens, and it forms these huge sheets over the Barrens, white with flowers in the early part of the year, and then with these fuzzy wind-distributed seed heads, plumes later in the summer. Fringed gentian, the island fringed gentian, is a really beautiful and quite common gentian in many places. We have it here in the park in a couple of places, but it gets more and more common as you go further north. And flowers coat is one of we used to have almost a field of them growing where the nets were dried at one point. Herb Robert is fairly common plant in many places, but it's a splash of color in the Barrens. Huron tansy is only on the Barrens. A great place to see them is around Barrens. There are some very big patches of them on what some people call the Barrens Airport, the piece of cut-off highway that the fishermen use, and one guy used to land a plane on. Sea thrift, it's interesting. In many places you'd think of sea thrift as a seaside plant, but here it's really on the Barrens, both the limestone Barrens and on the serpentine Barrens, like the tablelands. And they don't get very big. In Europe, when you see thrift, sometimes they can be a meter or two across, huge clumps. Here, the plants usually only have one or two flower heads and a small cluster of leaves, and they're very sort of solitary. They have a completely different growth habit. There's a range of different kinds of violets you find on the Barrens. This is a typical one in the meadow areas, moist meadows, and also a whole range of different members of the pea family, from the alpine milkvetch, which is very small and inconspicuous, to the pheloxytrope that forms huge patches. There's a great area just around Table Head on both sides of the highway, where the highway gravel is covered with hundreds of these big oxytropes. Velvet bells is another partially parasitic plant that gets its nutrient from the plants around it. So its leaves don't get very big. And it has these peculiar, almost inconspicuous, velvety purple flowers. Encrusted saxifrage is common pretty well all along the coast, but it seems to do best on limestone hillsides, limestone cliffs. And because it's growing in limestone, it ends up with a surfeit of calcium. And what it does is pump that calcium out through hydathodes, these pores on the leaves, and pumps the calcium out in water. And as the water evaporates, the calcium crystallizes and forms these hard crystalline edges to the leaves. And that's probably a technique the plant is using to stop smaller animals from chewing on its leaves. It makes them less palatable, less easy to consume. This is the plant I was saying they call Mayflower in the northern part of the province, the purple saxifrage. There can be thousands of them as pioneer plants in places that have been bulldozed. That's probably the one thing that the bulldozing did. It destroyed a lot of habitat, but boy, it made for some amazing displays of spring flowers in the Barrens area when these plants are in full bloom. They also have little calcium crystals on the tips of their leaves. They're a bit harder to see than on the encrusted saxifrage. Roseroot is really more of a coastal plant, but it does really well in the limestone Barrens as well. It can put up with the harsh weather, the wind and water conditions, and around Boat Harbor, there are places where they're growing almost like buttercups in a field. The surface of the rocks is yellow with them. Trees don't do as well, and that's the whole point of the Barrens, that the plants that have woody growth, so trees and shrubs, cannot get enough energy or enough nutrients on the Barrens because of the soil characteristics and the wind and exposure conditions. So they grow very slowly and they don't grow tall. You end up with things like this carpet-like growth of larch. This is on St. John Island, and the plant was no taller than 2 centimeters above the ground. It was crawling as though a steamroller had flattened it out. But that's because of pruning and nutrient and so on, that it was its natural growth type for that area. Bog birch can grow taller in better conditions, but again, on the barrens, it grows creeping along the ground. This is a little piece of bog birch with both male and female flowers showing, but that's typical growth, and the plants just cannot get the energy to get any bigger. Other common willows in the barrens are things like hoary willow, here the female catkins on the right-hand side. This is a plant that usually grows in more sheltered parts, places where you have either water accumulating because they like wet soil, or where you have a little hollow, and they grow in the hollow, and that way in the winter that fills in solidly with snow, and they avoid desiccation. They do not do well anywhere that they're exposed to full wind in the winter. They just can't survive. So they're kind of marginal on the barrens. Beautiful willow is everywhere. And this plant, Salix glauca, unfortunately looks like all the other willows. It's the hardest one to work out. You can have a dozen willows and find out at the end that they're all Salix glauca, even though the leaves look different and the flowers look, it's a most annoying plant. Absolutely beautiful. This is what happens when the seeds are mature, the capsules open. Oops, the capsules open and the seeds, these very hairy seeds, burst out. Usually they get distributed by the wind, but in this case there was a rain and everything matted together, and it made for an interesting photograph, but the plant's not going to be happy. Reticulate willow is one of the really beautiful plants on the barrens. It's got this interesting net pattern on the leaves, both the top and bottom. If you flip them over, they don't have any hairs. You can see the veins very easily on the underside. And this one's been infected, interestingly, with a little insect. A sawfly has laid its eggs, and the eggs have caused galls to form. And the young sawflies the larvae are feeding on the soft material in those galls. And in the background is a bog rosemary flower, just to make it more interesting. Oh, and a bog birch. So you've got a whole island of vegetation right here. This is the silky willow. You can see the leaf turned over there with the long silky hairs on the underside. This is a close-up. Very common plant on the barrens, and again, in better conditions can grow much bigger. This is these are plants up to 1 meter tall from actually from Labrador. The female on the left, the male on the right. But on the barrens, these are flat to the ground and very, very small, rarely more than 20 centimeters across, 30 centimeters across on the ground. These are the male flowers close up of the silky willow. It's a very beautiful plant in spring. Berry willow, very common, often has thick contorted stems. Ground juniper snakes across the ground. It doesn't look at all like a juniper. It looks more like a vine. And these long, skinny stems grow very, very slowly, and often become very contorted, probably due to damage to the roots, because in the junipers, the roots feed sectors of the stem. They don't feed the entire stem. So when one major root dies, that part of the stem stops growing, and the rest of the stem, as it elongates, causes the stem to twist and contort and form these peculiar rope-like structures. You can see in this one that part of the stem has bark and part of the stem hasn't. And that's probably what accounts for all these strange twisted corkscrew stems that you see on the limestone barrens. This is a slice through one of the ground junipers. Stems is highly magnified. It's only about 2 centimeters across, but it has about 300 growth rings. They're very, very slow growing. And as you can see, they're not rings anymore. The center is over, what would have been the center is over on the left, and the growth would all be occurring over on the right-hand side. The rest of the bark has died. So the only living strip of bark was on the right-hand side, putting on layer after layer after layer, while the center of the plant, of the stem was rotting away or being abraded away by blowing sand. Very peculiar little trees. Other peculiar habitats you find on limestone is wetlands like marl ponds, where you find wild chives and other strange plants. Very, very interesting to explore. Rich fens, and there are rich fens up and down the peninsula. This is the place you'll find things like the Calms lobelia, butterworts, most commonly on the fens, slenderleaf sundew, showy lady slipper. They all like these limey, nutrient-rich waters of the fens that develop over limestone. They don't do well in bogs. There's just not enough nutrient for them there. And very quickly, we'll do a couple of limestone animals. These are animals that aren't restricted in any way to limestone, but they are living in limestone habitat. Here in the park and up the coast north of here, there are a number of different islands, limestone islands, and they're used as nesting grounds by various gulls and kittiwakes and ducks and so on. So they're important for bird life that way. Caribou are often seen on the Barrens, particularly in the last couple of years at Port au Choix. There's been a small herd there that comes right out to the visitor center and provides all sorts of photographic opportunities for people. It's amazing some of the shots that I've been seeing from there. But the caribou like to be out in the open in the summer because the wind on these headlands keeps the flies off them. And it's not mosquitoes and black flies we're talking about. It's the warble flies and bot flies that are these big, nasty parasitic flies that actually get into the sinuses and throats and under the skin of the caribou. It's really important for them to have windy conditions that can keep those parasites off them. So that's why they tend to stay out in the open there. Moose are visitors to the Barrens. There's not a whole lot of food there, except maybe in the ponds, but the moose can cover a lot of ground very quickly and a lot of water too. They've actually swum all the way out to St. John Island, and there's quite a population there. And there's a hunt there this year because of that. Yeah, that'll be interesting. We'll hope that the Griscom's arnica and other rare plants are not damaged. Red fox is, the foxes are quite common on the Barrens. You'll often see the droppings. And if you're really lucky, you come across some kits like I did on this occasion at Cape Norman. Coyotes occasionally, they'll be out in the Barrens, probably looking for ground nesting birds and berries and anything else that's available there. You don't see them very often. And I certainly have come across an Arctic fox, and that was quite amazing. Boy, can they move fast when they're scared. The foxes drift down on the ice in the spring. Yeah, exactly. Because of the cold conditions and proximity to Labrador, these things have come down on the ice, as do polar bears, and get marooned here. Unlike polar bears, you don't worry too much. Well, maybe you should worry about the foxes because they sometimes bring rabies when they come down. But the polar bears tend to either go back or get shipped back, whereas the foxes stay here. And occasionally you see bear droppings and bears, again, because of berries and other things growing on the heath around the Barrens, not so much what's on the Barrens themselves. There's lots more information about the ecology of the Barrens and about the organisms you're going to see in the Exploring the Limestone Barrens book. That's available through Grossmo Incorporating Association and other people. So you can get more information by poking around in that. And what we'll do now is we'll talk just a little bit about threats to the Barrens. The big threats now are still things like land development or buildings and roads. Off-road vehicle use is definitely a threat to many of the Barrens. Net drying and wood piling around some of the communities are sort of smaller scale threats where people have to drive onto the Barrens to pile their firewood or do other things related to their work. But a really big problem that's coming up is wind turbines, as we said, particularly on the southern Barrens immediately, but with this interest in developing wind turbines wherever that seems to be a breath of wind right now. Other barrens all around the island, or other headlands all around the island, are probably worth keeping an eye on, because there is the constant threat that some of these really important habitats could be destroyed.
And it's not the turbines.
It's not the turbines, it's the infrastructure. Yeah, the turbines, a great idea, wonderful to be able to generate electricity with a turbine. But all the infrastructure, the quarrying, the roads that have to be built, the hydro lines that have to be built, and the digging that has to be done to install these things and maintain them, can destroy a very large area of land. And when we're talking about 0.01% of our province being limestone barrens, surely some of those other much larger portions of the province could be a better place for putting the windmills than right on top of these very rare plants. Anyway, so and climate change, of course, about which we can't do very much other than hope that we do the right thing in the next few decades. That will cause all sorts of problems with these barrens. This is a really interesting site. It's a bulldozer scrape that was made in the 1960s. I'll show you a closer photograph of it in a moment. But you can see there's very little drawing on it. It's right off the side of the main road. It has a few little pioneer plants coming up, but this is 60 years later, and it still hasn't regrown. This gives you an idea of just how long it takes to establish vegetation on one of these barrens. The bulldozer just came down through that heathland, scraped up the plants to see what was there, to see if there was any gravel they could use for building the road, and then abandoned it. And 60 years later, it's still gravel. This is what it looks like from the air. In 1968, this is a photograph on the left-hand side. You can see it very clearly. It's black and white. It couldn't find there were no color shots at that point. And on the left, of course, it still looks exactly the same. There's no real change to that site after all this time. So this is one of the reasons that any work being done in the limestone barrens, even if people say they can replant or reestablish vegetation, they can't. It cannot be done. These barrens take generations to regrow when they've been damaged. ATV use is rampant throughout the barrens, unfortunately, because they're flat and they're open and they're gravel. And what could you hurt anyway? I guess is the way people think about it. And so you see tracks everywhere. You see beaten down vegetation. And as soon as you destroy that thin skin of living plants, as you see on the left-hand side, all of a sudden, wind and water get in there, wash out the soil, and that heath starts to die back. And once an edge of the heath is killed off, the wind keeps getting in under there and taking up more and more and more. So this can be incredibly destructive, and it can only take a few passes sometimes to do this kind of damage. This is a juniper that was run over once. It was 100-year-old when I cut the wood, just about 100 years old, and it was completely killed by being crushed by one pass by an ATV wheel. Green energy isn't green if it destroys rare ecosystems and organisms. That's the one thing that we have to keep reminding people, that you can call it green energy, but it's only green if it's not doing damage. That is the most important message. There's a lot of work being done. We're getting close to the end. Anne has told me that the time is getting short. There's a lot of work being done to try to understand the barrens and to protect the barrens. Inventory work continues. There are still people going out on the barrens to see what's there. There's research being done, particularly by students from Memorial University, Louise Hermanit's students, and from and other people's students working out there trying to figure out how these plants work and what's killing them and what's keeping them going. Monitoring is being done both by the province and by the national park to try to keep an eye on the rarest and most endangered species. Damaged sites are being restored or restoration attempts are being made on damaged sites, such as at Sandy Cove, where they're bulldozing and dumping of waste and all sorts of other things had occurred, and weeds had pretty well taken over the site. And so there's quite a large restoration site that's already being attempted there, and that's going to be expanded in the coming years. Here's an example of some of the work going on, trying to get debris out of the soil, and trying to get plants potted up, protected from the site before the waste material on the surface could be bulldozed off. There are interpretive signs that have been put up in different places to try to alert people, both local people and people who are visiting, to the importance and the rarity of some of the plants on the Barrens. And these have been installed in a number of different sites up and down the peninsula. There are stewardship tools such as Limestone Barrens posters, the guidebook I was telling you about earlier on, posters, talks, all sorts of events to try to help people understand what a rare and important place they're living in, why these Barrens are so appreciated by other people, and why it's worth keeping them going. And of course, there's John Maunder's website, the Limestone Barrens website, which has all sorts of background information, again, for anybody who wants to look a bit more deeply into the Barrens. There was an art and science symposium in 2003, Limestone Barrens Project, which again helped to draw people's attention to the beauty and the scientific importance of the Barrens. And for a while, we actually had Limestone Barrens interpreters at both Portage National Historic Site and at Burnt Cape. And unfortunately, neither of those programs are continuing at this point. And lots of people go out there to look for interesting and rare plants and try to increase our knowledge of the Barrens. We talked about the Botrychians earlier. Don Farrar on the right-hand side is a Botrychium expert from the US. And there was a field trip, several field trips earlier on this year with various suspicious-looking people like John Maunder and Paul and Diane. And no, several years back, and trying to find as many different species of these moonworts as we could. It was a very interesting time, and fascinating. It will be fascinating to finally hear some results from it. And there are also field trips by people who are just interested in plants. So here are probably many of you tonight on several different field trips up to the Limestone Barrens and different parts of the Northern Peninsula, looking at those plants and enjoying them. And every time we do something like this, it does help local people understand, because when they see all these people going out there, they really start to understand that this is not just a strange niche obsession, that these are important plants, and there are a lot of people who are interested in actually taking a close look at them. So here we have a series of mugshots of people exploring and really getting up close and personal with some of these plants. And with this gallery of photographs, that pretty well concludes our program for this evening. If anyone has any questions or anything they want to discuss, we'll do that in just a moment. I'll get through the last couple of photographs and hope to see you all on the Barrens. Good evening.
Well, I, for one, can say that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
And Anne.
And taking
I want
it easy.
to go back. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, it was perfection. I have to say, it was perfection.
No, the Barrens are perfection.
Yes, but something that your geology, all the pictures were great, but your collection of the geology, it was absolutely stunning. Nice to see. I got two questions. I wanted to ask you about, I know you gave this talk, I don't know if it's the Philadelphia Society or the Pennsylvania. What was your reaction? Are they all coming up here now?
I really don't know. The problem with giving a Zoom talk is you don't get to see people's faces, and you only get to talk to a couple of people at the end afterwards. So you often don't know how something's gone over. I can't hear any feedback from people as I'm talking, and I can't see them. So it's a very peculiar way of delivering a talk. There were a lot of questions afterwards. They definitely sounded interested, but whether we'll have a flood of people from Philadelphia here, I really don't know. It would be fun to see.
Yeah, I'm sure they loved it. The other question regarding the wind turbines, when they go in, will there be any will they in any way try to save the plants that are around? Will they ask for advice on where to put them to save some of the precious plants that are around those turbines?
Right now, I'm not sure quite what the status of things is. The hope was that they would relocate turbines that were in the areas that were important to limestone plants. This is particularly for the Port-a-Port project that's going on. And I think what they said they would do is they would try to have the turbines
to get that down?
On the other side of the road. So whether they do that or not, I don't know, because you can't relocate these plants, really. Even though we tried to do that at Sandy Cove, the roots are so deep and they're so fragile, and the soil is so prone to churning. If you put them in the wrong place, they'll just get churned out by freezing and thawing. Winds are so strong that planting something on the Barrens and hoping that it's going to be there the next year, if it hasn't grown in place and got its roots down, there's a really good chance it's just going to get blown out of the ground. So really, you can't relocate them. If you go in there and you're going to do something, you're going to pretty well kill everything in that area. And because they do frequent maintenance on these things, and because, as Anne mentioned earlier, there's infrastructure such as the gravel pits and the hydro lines and the roads, the access roads, and everything else that's involved. You can, and these are 600 foot tall towers. So you can imagine the components, these huge components being dumped down on the Barrens so they can then reassemble them. That's going to take up a lot of space. And these Barrens are not that big. They look extensive when you're on them. But as I showed you with the photograph of St. John's with the 40 kilometer square kilometer circle, they're not big. They're not big at all.
But Michael, one thing adding to that, the blades on these things, and you said the tower is going to be about 600 feet high, which I understand is probably true. But I mean, each blade is probably 200 plus feet long. And when they talk about, oh yeah, we'll just put the roads in there neatly and tidily. And have you ever tried to turn a truck with a 250 foot trailer? Blades
Not
are
recently.
these blades are 250 feet long, and they're supposed to be, just sort of maneuvered in amongst turns and twists and topography and stuff, let alone trying to get through some of the towns on the Port-a-Port Peninsula to get to the place. I mean, these roads that they're going to have to build are going to have to be like just hugely big and long sweeping turns and stuff, and then these blades wear out. And if you go to some of these sites, say the one down in Fermuse on the Avalon Peninsula or something, which is right near the road, I mean, there's piles of these old blades. They don't last all that long, and every time that they wear out, they got to go in tractors and do all these things and big trucks just to get the blades in there and then hoisted up and fitted back out. And they got heaps of these old ones just thrown up. It's not gonna be neat and tidy, and it's gonna take huge road systems that are sweep all over the place, no matter what anybody says. You can't whip a 250-foot blade just in and neatly like turn right angle turns.
And if you were doing it in a place in a habitat that wasn't as rare as the limestone barrens, you could sort of understand it. It would make some sense. If it gets us around burning oil, and if there is an advantage to doing it, and we can do it in a place that is not valuable for anything else, sure, maybe it's worth doing. But if you're going to do it in some of the most important habitat for rare plants in this entire province, plants that don't grow in other habitats because they can't, then really that seems to be completely missing the point of going green. Green isn't one thing that you do. It's a way of living. It's a way of sustaining the world around you. And by sacrificing the limestone barrens so that Nova Scotia company can make money by selling power to Germany, that seems not to be the right move. It seems very, very short-sighted.
Sad.
Yes. Other questions? Oops.
We're speechless, that's all.
Michael, I just have a question about how the other limestone barrens that you know of around North America or in the world are doing. Like, I know there's one in the Grey Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, and I'm familiar with the one in the Burren in Ireland. But there are many others.
They're all very different. The alvars in southern Ontario have a completely different suite of plants, and obviously our rare plants don't even get there.
Okay.
Our endemic plants, but in the alvars they tend to be really moist in the spring, and then they go stone dry in summer, and so the plants that live in them are adapted to those kinds of very peculiar conditions. Ours stay moist through the summer, so it's a totally different suite. In the Burren, there seem to be a lot of plants that are that are very similar, but there they also have a 1,000 or 2,000-year-old grazing history that complicates the whole story, because the Burren is it's limestone that looks very similar to ours, with many plants that are either very close related or even in some cases the same species. But they also have hazel, masses of European hazel that if nothing is done, the hazel will cover those barrens very, very quickly. It grows anywhere there's any bit of soil and can crowd out the rare plants. For the longest time, that wasn't a problem because cattle were grazed there in the winter, and the cattle would eat the hazel, the young hazel branches, and any edible bits of the hazel they get hold of, and that kept the hazel at bay. At some point, someone decided to stop the browsing or the grazing on those limestone barrens. Whether that was an agricultural decision or somebody thought it would protect the barrens, and that meant that all of a sudden the hazel grew out of control and started to threaten the rare species. So they've actually had to reinstitute the grazing pattern, the older grazing pattern, in order to maintain those barrens as a habitat for rare plants, which is a rather interesting conundrum. Apart from that, there are not a whole lot of places where you have barrens of the sort that we have here. They're not. I can't think of anywhere else in Canada. Yeah, maybe in the Arctic, but other parts of temperate Canada, I can't think of anything really similar other than those alvars. In the US, there are lots of deserts and things like that, but not moist barrens like we have. And certainly there are very few places that would have the cryogenic, the freezing, thawing soil features that we have here that are so important for both keeping plants out and providing habitat for other plants.
Thank you.
Michael, you touched very briefly on some of the outcroppings of limestone. There are quite some notable outcrops / scree / high angle limestone things that have some very interesting plants on them, like for instance in places in the Humber Gorge and out
Yes.
past Cox's Cove and out around the headlands from Cornerbrook in places like oh God, I can't forget now, Raglan Head and other places that are
Yes, yeah,
tucked
yeah.
away. So some pretty high angle things where sometimes the plants are sort of growing in little pockets at the bottom of a cliff, just on the top of a scree slope, that sort of thing. So
Yes.
they seem to be sort of even officially kind of ignored in Newfoundland, and really some of the really rare things we have in these outcrops or sides of rivers. Grand Falls, for instance, has got a peculiar sort of brownish limestone that's sort of down behind the mill that's got some interesting stuff on it. So, you know, there are different flavors and angles and, you know, sort of different versions of limestone barrens that are sort of vertical or down by rivers or somewhere.
And pretty well unexplored because it's just so damn dangerous.
Yeah.
This is where things like, at one point you talked about using telephoto lenses for looking at them, but drones too offer all
Drones, yeah.
sorts of
Oh, yeah.
possibilities.
Drones, yeah.
So that, and way safer than climbing up and trying to get up right onto them to see what's there.
Yeah. Well, we were up on Raglan Head and a few other places during the Rare Plant Project, and I
Pretty
tell
amazing.
you had to be careful at that.
Yeah.
You could get yourself
I
done in.
keep looking at those cliffs and the gorge, Humber Gorge, and
Yeah.
thinking how interesting it would be. But
Well,
no,
there's some.
no.
Claudia's found some pretty interesting stuff there.
Oh,
So
she has, yeah.
Might I comment on the photography was lovely. When you did that one plant and you put the penny by it,
Oh yes.
that was a really good idea, because when you see the actual plant on the screen, you don't know. And I know you said a lot of them were like 2-3 centimeters high. It's hard to visualize, but putting
Yes,
something
right.
alongside of it, like the aluni or something like that. I've done that when I've been out taking pictures, because I can't
Excellent, yeah.
remember how big or small they are. But it also gives you a more visual of how tiny they really are.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yes, yeah. I must do that more frequently.
Yes, please.
I
I
do
thoroughly enjoyed them.
I do wonder if any of what we saw tonight really happened. I noticed on the bottom of the Zoom screen there's a button, AI companion. Who knows what we were watching?
Oh,
That I don't have that, John.
interesting.
Michael, that was awesome, by the way. But I was wondering if you had advice for like willow identification up there, like how much to expect, how not to lose your mind,
Yeah.
like hot tips, just because I find that the thing that I'm getting stuck on, I guess.
Oh my.
Or maybe I shouldn't be worrying about it as much as I do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the willows, well, especially blessed glauca, Salix glauca, it's astonishing how many different leaf shapes and sizes that one species can have. And chances are, if you can't identify it, it's going to be Salix glauca. I mean, no matter what's going on. Yeah, your best bet is to go and take a look at specimens if you can find specimens, and certainly you can in St. John's. That shouldn't be too hard. And just look at a range for the different species. Check Sue's website, Sue Mead's website, because she'll have all sorts of great identification information and photos. Check John's website, the Digital Flora, because again, that gives you not just you see what they look like in when they're on the ground, because some of them, if you've got them in your hand, it's not the same thing as looking at the plant in life. You get an idea of the habit of the plant when the photograph has been taken of the living organism. So those are probably your best bets. As far as using keys, it's just painful. The willows really, there's no easy, simple way. John, can you think of anything recent that might help with the problem?
Willows, yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
At least I'm not alone. That's
You
good.
gotta work at
No,
them.
no,
You
no,
gotta
no, no.
you gotta work at them, and you gotta go out and look at a lot of them, and you gotta
And you,
so that you see all the, you can sort of see how they sort of the similarities are when you've looked at enough of them, because sometimes you can look at some in one place and 2 feet away they're different, 3 feet away they're different, and so if you kind of get that feel, you know, it's
and if the cover of your Gray's Manual of Botany doesn't have chew marks on it, you haven't been trying hard enough.
no.
They drive you crazy. They really
Yeah,
can
well,
be quite painful.
just a little bit of advice. I used to have Volkswagen Beetle many years ago, and I did all my own mechanicking. Anyway, I used a book called How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive, a step-by-step manual for the complete idiot. Excellent. Now, the thing about that is it explained in there how best to decide on which Volkswagen Beetle to buy. Okay, how would you know when you had the right Beetle? And they suggested you sit on the roof in the lotus position and chant for a while. And then it will be revealed to you which one you should buy. So identifying willows is a bit like that.
Michael, one more question. What's the most obvious sign of climate change regarding the plants? Do you see anything that really shows that it's coming quick, you know, that it's obvious to you that it's climate change?
Ooh, interesting.
It's gonna be stuff like tree.
Yeah, and it's right. And usually sitting here, the change that you're probably most likely to see on the Barrens is going to be the incursion of shrubs and trees. So once you start seeing patches of trees and shrubs that have been fairly stable for a long time, either increasing in the space that they take up or getting taller, obviously things are changing. Right now, the trees are mostly living in hollows, places where they're protected from the wind because the snow packs in there, where the rest of the barrens are being blown clear. And if the snow is no longer packing in, or if the winters are no longer harsh enough, that the trees get pruned back every year to that snow surface, then you can see the conditions are changing. Watching the very hardy plants probably won't tell you very much, because they'll hang on right to the very bitter end when they get crowded out by other faster growing species. It's the species that are making incursions into the barrens that will probably be the most useful indicator.
Yeah, thank you.
But
Kristen has a question, Michael.
I have
Kristen?
a question related to that as well, climate change and the limestone barrens. So I'm like, I would call the limestone barrens home.
Oh, very good. Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed throughout the years is grass. So Porterschwa National Historic Site, like I started working there in 2018. Not a lot of grass. And then my last year working there was 2022, and there was grass like years before that, like the gravel kind of areas, the really barrens are now you go out there and it's just grass. And like, where did this grass come from? And when you go out on those like limestone cliffs, when you go to Phillips Garden and those cracks, they used to be like you'd get the trees in there and things like, and now it's grass. and there's horsetails everywhere. So like, what kind of like, I don't know if these like they don't seem to be normal limestone barren plants.
Yeah.
And like, what kind of impact do these like grasses and different plants that I never like seen there kind of just came out of nowhere in like 4 years?
That's very interesting. I haven't been up there for a couple of years, so I must go and take a peek. But certainly, there are a couple of things that could be happening. Horsetails, we have lots of horsetails around, and certainly if the conditions are right, they'll grow into any soil, and once they take over, they pretty well dominate. They're very hard for other plants to compete with. So maybe there are conditions that are maybe conditions are changing enough that the horsetails can actually move in. With the grasses, there are two possibilities. One is that local species, native species, are actually flourishing and moving into places that they weren't. The other possibility is non-native species, because we have most of the grasses you see around towns and along the highway are European or Eurasian species that have been introduced. And again, if conditions are right, both native and non-native species could move into the limestone. There's nothing wrong with limestone as gravel as a soil for these plants. What keeps them out is the combination of the limestone and the harsh conditions. And if those conditions are no longer so harsh that the plants are killed off or unable to survive from year to year, then you're right. They could very easily move in and start displacing some of the rarer limestone loving plants. But I will have to go up and take a look. That's really quite worrisome. Thank you.
One quick thing, Michael. If the climate keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer, and it may result in a lot of drying in the summer, not the winter, but the reverse in the summer, and you know, maybe even lead to some sort of desertification of some of these open areas where the winds will blow and just dry everything out.
It could be good, yeah.
Yeah. So that might help grass, but it might not help the limestone.
No good for Brea.
No good.
No good for most of those limestone living plants. No. It is really worrisome because there is no other habitat for them. This is the very last little scrap of habitat, or these are the little scraps of habitat left over on the entire island that they could have inhabited originally. They've been pushed into these little coastal edges, and you can only push them so much further, and then they're gone. There's nowhere else for them. And you're right, we don't know what's going to happen with summers. If they get warmer or if they get drier, that could be the end for a lot of those species. So yeah, it is a great concern.
Could it also be because that the gypsy moth becomes a bigger problem? Like, could they possibly, because right now they're being brought in by storms, is that right?
The diamondback moth.
Sorry, I always got them mixed up. The diamondback, yes.
I was going to say, what don't I know about
Sorry.
gypsy moth?
That's another world, sorry.
Get me scared. Okay, the diamondback moth certainly is being brought in from Midwestern US, actually, I guess, where they build up to large numbers in spring, and then they get blown east, northeast, by the winds, and some of them end up here. And because they are really fond of plants in the cruciferae, the Brassicaceae, the cabbage family, because they can smell the sulfur compounds, they can sense where these plants are. When they land on the island, they scramble for anything that's in that cabbage family, and unfortunately, both Breas are in the cabbage family, so that's why they get clobbered by the diamondback moth every summer. What might happen with changes in climate, I don't know. The difficulty is that we're in that fallout path. We can never not be in that fallout path because that's the major airflow over North America. It's going to continue, and as long as there are diamondback moths feeding on the farms in the American Midwest, we're going to have diamondback moths raining down on the Breas here in the province. So we're stuck with it.
Michael, we have one well, we have lots of comments, which I'll share with you tomorrow. They're all good. But we had a question also from Judy who says, what is actually being done or has been done to protect these plants from wind energy construction projects? Is there anything that's being done? Or
the province has to approve the plans for different projects. So there's been a whole pile of discussion, as far as I understand, with the province about where what do they call it? Wind energy, GH, whatever the company is. They've been presenting their plans to the province, and the province has said whether they agree with or disagree with the locations that they've selected. And they had hundreds of sites that they wanted for their towers on the Port-au-Port Peninsula. And that's just the first phase of their plan. They also, remember, at one time wanted the top of the Serpentine Hills, the top of the Lewis Hills and the top of the Blow Me Down Mountains pretty well for all of their installation too. So that's a real concern. For the time being, that's not on the list, but they still, I'm sure, want it, because they said originally the project could not go ahead without those two other sites. And those are also incredibly important and valuable resources for the province. It shouldn't be squandered on somebody else's wind energy. Anyway, back to me forgetting what the question was. Sorry, maybe you could.
She's wondering if anything could be done or was being protected.
Really, the only thing that can be done is for the province to say, no, you can't have this, but you can have this area over here. They want the places of the highest wind energy. But if that highest wind energy happens to coincide with something that is biologically important for the province shouldn't give it up. They should be given a slightly lesser location for their wind energy site and just have to live with it. That's the way I feel about it. But really, it's all got to be the province saying what is most important and what has to be protected and sticking with that. There's no other way that we can protect it, unfortunately.
There's one quick comment on that, is that nobody seems to be thinking about the visual pollution. I mean, they want, people want to come to Newfoundland to see the scenery, the beauty, all that old stuff. And if they come here and see something that looks like Germany, with windmills absolutely everywhere spoiling up the view, are they going to come? And I don't know if that's being put in the formula very, very well.
Not, I don't think by the province, but people on the Port have been very vocal about their distrust and discomfort with what's being proposed for their area, really sort of behind their back, because originally this was supposed to be an offshore installation. It was supposed, all the mills were supposed to be floating on the water. Then the very last moment they changed over and said, oh, no, we'll put them all over the Port-au-Port Peninsula. So they sort of been playing fast and loose with the information and with what they've been telling people. So there are certainly all sorts of people in Port-au-Port and other parts of the province who are very upset with what's going on. And really all we can do is all keep an eye on it and comment as loudly and as vehemently as possible if they start to screw up.
Yeah, there's not many long-term jobs coming out of it either.
Oh, no. They never are from these. They never are from these projects. They never are. They talk a big line. They talk about billions and billions of dollars, but no, there's nothing in the long term. And all of the power and all of the money gets shipped offshore. It doesn't stay on the island. This is a Nova Scotia company or a consortium, and the power is going to be shipped to Germany. They will be paid for the power. None of it goes to the province. So it's a very peculiar arrangement.
Michael, there's more than just John Risley and his GB whatever. I mean, they're wanting to put the windmills all across the Isthmus of Avalon for a heat plant at Comachance and other places.
Yeah.
So
But
I've
I've seen a lot of windmill farms up in Ontario, And there's nothing unattractive about them. They look rather interesting and rather nice. It's very clean. And one thing about it is, and they say you talk about green energy, but green energy is very important for the future of my grandchildren and my great grandchildren to come.
I totally agree with that. But did you go? Did you look? Did you look at the sites?
If we don't control climate warming, there won't be any plants anywhere.
And I didn't say I had anything against wind power. What I said was wind power should be put in places that are not critically important for other things, such as plants that can't live anywhere else. You wouldn't knock down the center of St. John's. You wouldn't clear out St. John's and put your wind power there because it's the best place to put a wind power station, because that would be nuts, wouldn't it? But if you're going to put them in the middle of the most important habitat, that does not make sense. And when you look at these things from a distance, they can look fine. They're just windmills. But as soon as you go up close and you see the devastation to the area around them, all the roads, all the wires, all of the quarries and so on, you realize it's a much, much bigger thing than just a couple of little windmills on a hill. It's a huge, huge installation. So yeah, I agree with you. For all of our futures, it's really important that we move away from oil and coal and other burnt fuels.
Awesome.
We can't just go slapping them down in the most important habitats for wildlife.
Michael, I hope that you can have a voice about the areas where they're going to be wanting to put them. About the plants that are
very
there.
much.
Well, you've got a good voice, and I hope you use it to protect and save those areas. Yeah, I think we should probably clue up now, because this could go on for a long time.
Sure.
But thank you so much. And thank you everybody for coming. I'll
night, everyone.
Comments tomorrow.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you,
night,
everybody. It's a great.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much. See ya.
See ya.